Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Jack Troy, filling in for Zach Gibson, and this is TribLive's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. Inflation has been all the rage lately, and by that I mean people are very angry. Simply put, inflation is when more prices are rising than falling, and that's the usual state of the economy, even a healthy one. But cost hikes went far beyond the norm the last few years, peaking at about 9% in mid-2022. We'll talk more later about what exactly that means. Inflation has since returned to near normal levels, but the damage is done, whether it's cars, groceries, housing, the list goes on. Everything costs more than it used to. I've spent the last 3 months working on a series called Inflation Explained with fellow TribLive reporter Patrick Varine, where we examine price increases in all sorts of industries. That's 3 months of crash courses in economics, talking to aggrieved business owners, and chatting with cash-strapped customers. Here to discuss what we learned today is Patrick Varine. Patrick, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So, this was this was just as much, I think, of a learning experience for me as it might be for a reader who is as unfamiliar with, some of the larger concepts and things surrounding inflation as I was. I've been in this business now for almost 20 years, but business and finance reporting is not something that I have done a lot of and certainly not specialized in. So, whenever we sort of sat down and started planning this out, it was a topic that was a little bit intimidating for me when I first started to sit down and think about it. And then as I thought about it more, I decided to maybe look at it more as an opportunity, so that when I'm talking to these people who have PhDs in economics and have been studying this, for decades upon decades, I can approach it in the most honest way possible, which is, please explain this to me as though I am a sixth grader. You know what I mean? And that's really the place that I wanted to start from, which I think is why we ultimately settled on groceries as the first topic, because that's the thing that people think of first and foremost when they think of inflation, because everybody goes to the grocery store once every week and a half, certainly on a regular basis. And so it's the place where you see those prices go up, or you see like, hey, this bag of Doritos is not as big as it used to be and I'm still paying the same, or I'm paying more for it now. And so that was kind of the energy that we went into this series with, because, both you and I went out and talked to consumers, for that grocery story. I went to my local Shop and Save and talked to a handful of people, and it wasn't always the same thing. It was buying stuff from the butcher shop. For one woman I talked to, it was the cost of I think maybe toilet paper and paper towels for another couple that I spoke with. But everybody was worried about the price of some sort of groceries going up.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought was interesting was a lot of people seem to be wondering, well, when are grocery prices going to go back down to where they were before the pandemic? And to me, that was the most, and maybe for you too, that was the most interesting thing that I heard from the economist we talked to in that first piece, was that, I made sure to bring this quote from Penn State agribusiness professor Stan Ernst, which we both thought both kind of looked at it and were like, whoa. Because he said, the bottom line to me is, if you expect grocery prices to go back where they were, say, 5 years ago, I would expect you to be a little bit delusional. I liken it to what a lot of us who cover, local governments see in the form of, your school districts or your boroughs and townships that will institute a tax increase. I guess maybe school districts more in particular, because, I cover a local school district that put in a tax hike because they were taking out a bond for a big elementary school project. And one of the more conservative people on the council was, okay, but when this is done, we're going to rescind that tax hike, right? We're going to give that, we're not going to just keep collecting this. And, it was dead silence from the rest of the school board.
Right, sure we are.
We're not giving that money back. You know what I mean? So in one way, that was kind of my biggest takeaway from the groceries one, was this notion that people are anticipating that prices will go back to pre-pandemic levels when, like you said, even in a healthy economy, things are growing inflation-wise somewhere between 1% and 3% a year.
Yeah, and I want to put a finer point on that later, but let's maybe back up a little bit. And, I gave briefly kind of how I interpreted all the top line reporting, but I'm curious how you would explain in a nutshell, because it's a complicated topic, but the general causes, impacts, and then finally the outlook for inflation. I mean, I take it it's not just groceries that are going to be staying high. It's something we saw in a lot of places, but
Right.
just want to make sure we kind of set that baseline for listeners, right?
Yeah, and the way that the federal government tracks inflation is through this consumer price index, which most economists will describe it to you as like this basket of things that are largely common to most people who are working, renting, own a house, that sort of thing. And part of it is groceries. Things are sort of weighted in the basket. Groceries are a part of it. Part of it is a large part of it. I found out whenever I was doing the housing market inflation story is something called shelter inflation, which is sort of an average of what people are paying for rent across the country, and then something that's called sort of a like homeowner equivalent, which is the basic average cost of like running a household between paying your mortgage, paying your utilities, seeing those go up potentially year over year, that sort of thing. So there's all these different items that are part of this, they call basket of consumer goods, and all of that makes up the consumer price index that can give you a general picture of where inflation is in the country across a sort of a number of different markets.
Right. And I dropped that 9% number earlier. That is the consumer price index for, like you were saying, the kind of general basket. Can you kind of explain what that actually means? Because it gets thrown around a lot and I think commonly misunderstood. So when we look at the CPI, right, what is that compared to, that 9%?
Oh man.
I know we did 10 weeks of this and it's still kind of hard to explain because it's not very intuitive.
Yeah, no, it's not super intuitive. I'm not really sure that I can explain it.
I will maybe try to bail you out here and tell me if I'm going the wrong way, but it's, when you see that 9%, and again, that was the peak of the recent spike in inflation, that is, this general basket is 9% more expensive than the same time last year, essentially, which is a very like economist way to think about things and not a ordinary consumer way to think about things, but that is how it's, commonly measured. Does that kind of line up with the,
Yeah.
Gotcha. So we were talking groceries, and I think that is definitely the most salient of all the categories we looked at, which were, like you said, housing, utilities. I think you did one on insurance. So we really covered a wide range of topics, but what industries were kind of the quirkiest in their causes for inflation? We saw across the board a lot of industries, right? It's, oh, well, the war in Ukraine or the weather's getting more extreme, but what industries did you see where it was actually super specific what was going on and maybe not even that tied into broader macroeconomic trends?
Well, what I thought worked out nicely is, at least to me, in the topics that we were covering, things started to sort of get more esoteric as we went along. With the groceries, like you said, it's pretty easy to imagine the chain from the ground to the grocery store. Somebody has to grow the wheat. Somebody has to ship it to the Nabisco factory. Somebody has to turn it into Triscuits. Somebody has to truck it to the, it's easy to see those steps along the way and how those can contribute to inflation. If, the price of gasoline rises, then all those shipping costs go up. That's a fairly simple thing to like wrap your head around. Whereas with something like, I thought that the housing market inflation story that I worked on was one of the ones where there's so much more going on than like the price of wood going up, the price of raw materials like lumber, because that's kind of the basis for a lot of the different areas where inflation makes its way into the economy. Is, the Phil Lempert, one of the guys I talked to for the grocery story, had said, you got 50,000 products in the grocery store. They all started in the ground somehow, for the most part. And that goes for stuff like housing materials too, with the raw materials, so like lumber and things like that. And the housing one I thought was interesting because, over and above the raw materials and shipping costs, you also have things like, the housing markets in particular areas. Most of the housing experts I talked to said that there's a housing shortage. There's an affordable housing shortage in the United States. The estimates range pretty wildly from like 1.5 million all the way up to 5 million in terms of like how many affordable houses do we need in the United States in order to sort of solve the current housing deficit. But there are other things that factor into that when you're talking about housing. There's a lot more of the like supply and demand. If there's a lot of people moving into a particular part of the Pittsburgh area, you'll see the housing prices there go up. And generally speaking, housing prices have continued to go up all throughout the pandemic. When we were at the peak of inflation, that was also when we had really high interest rates. So if you had a house, you didn't want to try and upgrade because you'd be crazy. I mean, I bought my house in 2011. I would be insane to have sold it any time in the last 5 years because I'd have doubled my mortgage interest rate. So people who had a house were holding on to it. People who wanted a house couldn't find one necessarily that was within their price range. And so there were that type of thing that sort of factors into it. And then we talked to the chief economist for the National Association of Home Builders. And, again, I would have expected him for the most part to hammer on the uptick in the price of things like lumber. And that was, obviously one of the things that he mentioned, but he sort of laid out, 5 different things that he sees as sort of affecting the housing deficit in the United States. Number one is, a lack of lumber. He said, there's a 15% tariff rate on Canadian lumber, which is about a third of the lumber that gets used in the United States. And, again, it's a politically sensitive topic, but this man's the chief economist for a National Association of Home Builders, and he's like, tariffs are inflationary. It drives the price up. He said that, there's a lack of lending for what he referred to as, he called it acquisition development construction, which is basically the upfront cost that you need to take a piece of raw land and make it basically like cement pad ready. In Westmoreland County, the Industrial Development Corporation does a lot of that type of stuff. They look for state and federal loans so that they can take an industrial park and essentially make it what they call like pad ready. Like, here's a big giant cement pad. All you got to do is put your building on it, But a lot of that requires upfront financing. And I don't know a lot about the economics of individual construction companies, but my understanding is, that's not something that your average Pittsburgh area construction company can always just go out and get. The other thing that he mentioned was, a lack of skilled labor in the employment market. I've done tons of stories about that, about all of the local school districts around here, working to defeat this stigma around the skilled trades and introducing kids, where I was introduced to like VOTEC around maybe 8th or 9th grade. Now they're taking 4th and 5th graders to the local CTCs
Right.
and showing them like, check out this CNC laser cutter, look what this thing's doing, and not only that, look how much money there is to be made in that trade. I was raised with kind of the unspoken expectation that I was going to go to college and that was sort of it. I never thought of a job in the skilled trades necessarily, but I had a buddy of mine at Duquesne. He had to drop out of school for a whole variety of reasons during his junior year. And he ended up doing 18 months out at Rosedale Tech. And before he graduated, he had a van, he had a job. And as long as people are using air conditioning, like, he's going to have plenty of work and make plenty of money. That's just not something that people of my, like, I'm in my early 40s, and that's just not necessarily something that we were raised to believe was like the option that we should be shooting for. Whereas a lot of these companies, home builders, electricians, plumbers, like, they can't get people through those apprenticeship programs fast enough. And there's tons of money to be made in that industry. So that was one of the things he said. He said there's a lack of available lots. They're not making any more land. So if you want,
good point. Yeah.
So if you want to build on it, you got to buy it from somebody. And one of the things that he also mentioned was legal and regulatory hurdles. He and another one of the folks that I interviewed for the Housing Story had mentioned that it could cost a developer about $100,000 in permit fees, impact fees, and other associated regulated costs, like, before they can put a shovel in the ground to start building. Maybe not a single family home, but like certainly like a lot of the neighborhoods that you see going up in and around the Pittsburgh area. So it was interesting to see how not just the raw materials cost, but other factors, other economic factors kind of, affected how home prices, sort of work in the real estate market.
Yeah, and I think that's something we saw a lot is that the base factors, and then there were these layers specific to the industry on top. I want to, well, I guess for lack of a better word, layer another question on what I just said before kind of shifting gears here. Did you see anything particular to Western PA, or are we all going broke together?
I think we're probably all going broke together. I mean, in speaking very generally, the real estate market, specifically like in Western Pennsylvania, is a little bit more affordable than other, comparable metropolitan areas. But I don't know that there's anything specific to the region that's affected. I mean, if anything, you could probably make a decent argument that Pittsburgh is well positioned, to, if it's possible, to sort of skirt the edges of some of the worst inflation that the country has seen, if for no other reason than because we have a lot of major highways that do intersect here. You can get to Ohio and the Midwest really quickly from the Pittsburgh area. You can hit highways to points south pretty quickly from here. So no, I don't recall anything, sort of very specific to Pittsburgh, other than talking to some of the more local real estate folks about kind of the market specific to this region.
Gotcha. So kind of returning to the politics of some of this, I mean, I think it was something that got spoken of a lot, in particular by President Biden, is price gouging, right? And I'm curious, I spoke with a certain set of experts. You mostly spoke with different ones. I'm curious what you heard on whether price gouging is a big part of this, whether it's something that can even be like legislated, or if it's just kind of a convenient scapegoat at times.
I mean, I think probably the real answer is somewhere in between, because I mean, I talked a little bit with Senator Bob Casey's office, because he has been out front, on a national level in terms of talking about, price gouging and wanting to try and address what he called shrinkflation, through some sort of legislation. But I mean, how do you, like, what's the bar? Like where does it go from the purpose of our business is to generate a profit to not that much profit? You know what I mean? Like and again, like this is where my limited knowledge of finance reporting and economics sort of comes into play, is like, I wouldn't have any idea where to set that bar, and I wouldn't know. I don't know who would. Who do you put on that? Who do you put on that regulatory board?
Right. Yeah, I guess it does pose the question of, how much profit is too much profit, and I think goes without saying that would be a pretty sticky issue.
I mean, people, some of the people that we talked to for the grocery store, like, they were mad at the grocery store, and the grocery store is like the last link in that chain. All the grocery people that I talked to said that for the most part, grocery stores operate on a pretty thin profit margin.
Yeah.
They're not the ones that are jacking the price up. And in some cases, it's not necessarily any one entity jacking the price up. Like we said, even with the groceries thing, if the price of oil goes up, that affects all your shipping for everything across the board. So there are other factors. And again, if I was a multinational, like, food corporation, like, that would certainly be my defense if anybody accused me of jacking up the prices on people. You're like, well, all of our other costs are going up.
No, that's a good point. I think you brought up something that might be a good way to back out of this, which is just, you were talking earlier about how you approached this from a place of, not being a business reporter, not being an economics reporter, probably knowing as much as the people we talked to in the grocery stores on that first story. And now, we've kind of come out the other side of this. There's one more article working its way through the editors about cable and streaming.
Well, that one was interesting, partly because the more that and maybe your experience was different than mine, but it didn't seem to me as though, at least on the streaming side of things, inflation had too much to do with why people are paying more. The general story there on the streaming side to me seemed to be like, all these companies were basically giving this away, and at least a gigantic company like Disney was more than willing to, like, just lose billions of dollars, in order to get to where they are now with that streaming service.
Yeah, I mean, I think it reflected something you see a lot of in the, I don't know, more innovative industries, which is okay, well, we'll just hemorrhage money. And then once we have the whole market, then we can make our money back. But I'm curious now on the other side of this, what would be like your 2-minute speech to those people we met in the grocery stores the first time around about how inflation works and how it should be understood? Where should fingers be pointed, or is it so complicated that everyone kind of deserves a finger point?
Well, I mean, one thing that I wish that I would have done and didn't think to do this with those initial interviews in the grocery store was to ask those people, what do you think causes inflation here at the grocery store? Because it would have been it would have been interesting to hear just the general public's thoughts, on what they think contributes to that. And with groceries, I imagine that most people would be able to sort of tell you like, oh, well, somebody gets paid to grow it, somebody gets paid to ship it, that sort of thing. But I certainly wouldn't have been able to explain why, like, your housing insurance premiums keep going up whenever we had started at this story, other than to maybe say, well, wood costs more, which is true, but there's other things that factored into it that I wouldn't have thought of just as a regular citizen. And yeah, what would I say? Well, I mean, as I've gotten older, I have taken more of an interest in like nonfiction history books. Not any one specific topic, but something that does really interest me is like sort of this view from 10,000 feet, as opposed to looking up at the grocery aisle in the grocery store, for lack of a better way to put it. You know what I mean? I've always been really curious about how things work on the level that you don't necessarily see on the surface. And so I would always encourage people, or I guess I would tell those people to sort of look at it from that perspective. Because you hear all the time that like we're in a global marketplace, and like the stuff that I'm ordering from Amazon could literally come from anywhere in the world. But like you don't always like actually stop to think about it, that like this LED light bulb that I ordered a 5-pack of from Amazon.com, like maybe it got made in South Asia, and then it got shipped over to China and got packaged, and then it got shipped over to somewhere else to be all boxed up and put into pallets. And then that went on one of those gigantic cargo ships and sailed it over to somewhere in America, probably Baltimore. It's just one of those things that we kind of take for granted, in an age where everything is so convenient like that. And so I think sometimes it just maybe slips a lot of people's minds that like things come from everywhere now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It got me thinking about the last beat I want to hit here, which is, does it really help to understand all this? I mean, is there anything we can do? Were there any tips you picked up along the way that you're like, oh, you know what, when I go to buy that thing, maybe I'll look at it that way? Or are we pretty much at the mercy of however the economy shakes out?
I think that probably depends on like what part of the CPI basket we're talking about, because with food, you are sort of at the mercy of the grocery chain. And things like shipping costs will always, play into what that particular part of the basket costs. With something like the housing market, certainly now is a little bit of a better time to be looking at buying a house or selling a house if you're in the housing market. But, most of the advice that I got there was, you kind of just have to follow the economy. And I mean, most of the economists said like, your interest rate's not probably going to go back down like below 4% anytime soon. Like, so don't look for that, but you can look at those numbers over time. That was one of the things that was what was really helpful for me, at least whenever I was trying to visualize like sort of this view from 10,000 feet, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics does have a lot of comparative data where you can look at last year versus this year in the CPI, or you can look at that over, you can look at it over a much longer time scale. They have data going way back, and at a certain point it kind of ceases to be helpful because the entire economy was sort of different then. But I think it's probably helpful to be able to look back, 10 to 15 years, for an adult consumer who has been alive and buying stuff or potentially renting or living in a house, all those years, to be able to look at that and, sort of see like, oh, this is the way that the housing market is trending. This is the way that interest rates are trending. And it might be a good time to buy a house now, as opposed to like, do I wait till next year? Maybe the Fed puts the interest rate back up another 0.25% or 0.5%. So I think it's really specific to what industry, you're sort of looking at.
I guess everyone will just have to read all 10. Gotcha. Well, hey, stop me if I missed anything big here, but I just wanted to thank you for making the journey out to our Tarentum office to talk inflation.
Well, I would like to thank you for making the journey with me to the end of this story series. It was, like I said, it was I really consider it to be a good learning experience, because like I said, this isn't an area of reporting that I do very often. And so I feel like going forward now, and maybe that's what I would say to those folks at the grocery store is, read all 10 parts in the series, but you can take some of the stuff away from that and apply it to, your consuming, as you sort of go forward. When you see that, like, why is this box of whatever, like I go with the bag of Doritos, but like, why is this bag of Doritos a little bit smaller? You'd be like, oh, well, okay, maybe they're trying to squeeze a little bit more profit out of this part of their industry. But yeah, I think there's stuff that you can sort of take away from the series and incorporate into sort of your broader economic outlook, maybe.
Make the world a little less confusing. I love it.
That was the goal, right? To explain inflation, if we could. And hopefully we did.
Hopefully. I think you did a great job explaining stuff today. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zach Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.